accessibility and inclusiveness to order for Wednesday, March the 12th. First off, we have the introduction of late items.
Thank you, Madam Chair. There are no late items to be introduced that we are aware of. Just wondering if there are any around the table from the committee members.
Okay, not seeing any, then I will ask for a motion for the adoption of the agenda. Moved by Alexandria, seconded by Councillor Armstrong. All in favor? Thank you. And we have one set of minutes from our meeting on January 8th. Were there any additions that anyone would like to make to those minutes? Not seeing any, so if I could have a motion for the adoption of those minutes. Moved by Sean, seconded by Alexandria. All in favor? Thank you, that carries. We have nothing under council communications. And so we're going to head into our presentations. The first one is on the Westwood Lake Park accessible wayfinding signage. And we have Charlotte Davis, our Deputy Director of Parks and Natural Areas here. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here to present this presentation along with Kelsey from the Tula Group. This is the second time that we're here with this topic, and there has been some work undertaken since we were last here. So we are now at the stage of having developed our signage group, our family, and we want to make sure that we've heard all of the feedback from the committee. And we're about to move on to some detailed design. So we've got some things that we want to run by the committee prior to moving on to that, which relate to the readability and the accessibility in general of the signing and our wayfinding family. So we've got some decision points for you today. And also in general, if there is any feedback that you have on the signage in any way at all, please do share. This is a great opportunity we have here. So thank you very much. And I'll hand it over to Kelsey.
Thank you, Charlotte, for the introduction. I am Kelsey Hurlbut. I'm the principal landscape architect at the Tula project. And as many of you know, we are working on the Westwood Lake beach enhancements and washroom project at First Beach. So I see a number of familiar faces. Thanks for having us again. In conjunction with that project, we're also working on a comprehensive accessible wayfinding signage for all of Westwood Lake. And I'd like to share just a little bit of where we're at in that process. And as Charlotte mentioned, gain a little bit of feedback from the ACAI to help us to continue to progress in the right direction. And there's gonna be time for questions at the end, but please feel free to jump in with questions as we go along. And happy to have this as a conversational point, because there are a couple of key decisions that we need to make today that'll help us. Next slide, please. So as Charlotte mentioned, there's a family of signs we're developing for Westwood Lake, and we're currently completing conceptual design, and we're now moving into detailed design, which we'll get into all the font sizes, what's on each sign, the font type, how the symbology translates, making sure that kind of meets an international standard. The family of signs includes directional signage, and that's used to direct users to destinations with the use of arrows and maps and panel blades. There'll be informational signage as well that will identify places, help users inform where they are, and help them make a decision on where they want to go next. Interpretive signage, which will help provide, users with stories and just general awareness of site-specific historical, cultural, and environmental context. And regulatory, which will help inform us, anybody using the park, of operational and safety information, including codes of conduct and statutory signage. So, are you being filmed? Are dogs allowed here? Are we allowed to be on leash? Is this an off leash area? Are we allowed to swim? Can you have a fire? That type of thing. Next slide, please. So in developing this family of signs, we're referencing the available applicable standards, including Accessible Standards Canada, which has a really useful draft out for review from 2023 in December, and it's the outdoor spaces and public review draft. And there's some key information here that will help us with wayfinding, outdoor wayfinding signage. important to note that there are many defined standards for accessible wayfinding, especially with regard to buildings and inside and navigating with inside buildings. And the outdoor wayfinding signage standards are, although there are pieces here and there, they're a little bit less comprehensive. So we'll be using the Accessible Standards Canada, BC Parks Universal Design Guide, and the ADA Accessible Standards to help us along and reference the standards that are available within those standards to implement a best practice policy. Next slide, please. So I think many of you, I think Charlotte might have shared this diagram before. In summary, our family of signs considers a similar allocation of information across the board, across each sign, which we'll show in a later slide. But what's special about this diagram is it helps us pay special attention to common reach zones, average midpoints of sight for different users, and an acceptable height range for tactile and braille inclusions. And so having this these typical heights for where this information can be included does really help us in translating that across a family of signs. Next slide, please. There you go. There you go. Okay. So with regard to ranges for average lines of sight, so where it's comfortable to look up, look straight, and look down, like those degrees, we considered children, adults, and individuals using wheelchairs. And you may have noticed that the average maximum and minimum lines of sight for children and wheelchair users are the largest and have the widest range. And that's due to children growing significantly between the ages of 4 and 16. And also it reflects the different wheelchairs that users may have, whether it's electric or it's manual. So that's why we see a larger range in those ones. And those are the ranges that we're looking to try and accommodate as best we can. Next slide. So this diagram, the colors across the board show how the information will be distributed across our family of signs, with green being optimal legibility zone, yellow indicating our regulatory information, and pink largely being dedicated to high-level directional information that's meant for observation from maybe slightly further away, so it's acceptable for it to be up a little bit higher. And just there's a note on this diagram, it is really important that all this information, all the writing that you see on these diagrams, or that's presented on these diagrams, has not been reflected from a detailed design perspective. It is just there for placeholders to help us understand how we want to organize information, and doesn't reflect a review on accessible font heights, font sizes, font type, and typical symbology. Next slide. So this map shows the entirety of Westwood Lake. The first phase of rollout will be implementing accessible wayfinding signage at First Beach, because that's what's in construction right now, and we're seeing this as a great opportunity to start there and work out any bugs that will then eventually roll out to signage being implemented all along the Westwood Lake Trail and helping people navigate the entirety of Westwood Lake Park. Next slide. So at First Beach itself, at Westwood, we'll plan to install welcome signage indicating that you have arrived at Westwood Lake Park, similar to the sign that was there previous, but located more upon the entry sequence as you're driving in or walking in. We'll look to implement a primary park kiosk that will serve to provide an overview of everything that Westwood Lake Park has to offer. Trails, bike trails, where you can bike, what are the destinations, where are the washrooms, where are the access points. Key destination signage, which will be located at First Beach, and talk a little bit about, show information about First Beach itself, as well as directional pedestrian signage and directional vehicular signage, which will help users navigate key decision points as you move through the park. So if this is one thing that we're looking to provide feedback on, these locations identified are not set in stone, and we are looking for feedback from the ACI on installation locations. So if you'd like to provide your comments today, that's very much welcome. But alternatively, if you'd like to take some time and review the presentation in more detail over the next week, please just contact the city with your comments on location, and we'll look to include that in the final implementation. So are there any questions right now?
Yeah, I'll take a speakers list, but first to Tammy.
Hi, Kelsey. On that W, the star with the W, what direction are the words facing?
They would be facing, as you move along Westwood Lake Road, move south along Westwood Lake Road, it would face north.
So it would face to the top of the page towards.
That's correct, with the idea that people are coming into Westwood Lake Park, and that would be the capture. So this sign would say Westwood Lake Park, and would also provide some indications on turn with an arrow potentially to turn right into the parking or go straight ahead for the boat launch.
Okay. Is there anything on the back of it?
No, not right now, but that's something to.
Okay. Same question on K1.
Mm-hmm. Of course.
Okay.
Same question on K1?
Yeah.
So this sign would show some directional sign. It would show a map of the park and where you're located at right now. Would have some regulatory signage on it. In this location, it would only just with wanting to locate it as closely as possible to the accessible parking. This would only face out and only be on. The information would only be on one side. However, in other locations that we've identified in the park for our key destination signage, it would wrap the sign and have mirrored information on both sides. And actually, the next few slides do show a high-level idea of what each sign might represent in the family of signs.
Yeah, maybe that would be helpful to see.
Yeah. We could flip through those and then maybe go back, Hillary?
Yeah.
Okay, so this was we've since, over the last week, we've since further developed this one, but this one would show, hey, you're entering Westwood Lake Park as you're moving into the space and moving towards Westwood Lake. This one was where we were discussing adding in a few high-level directional information, such as turn right into the parking or go straight ahead to the beach or the boat launch. And that's mainly because we don't want to hold a number of cars moving into the boat launch area. We want to capture those cars in advance and have them turn into the parking to help reduce car and pedestrian conflict. The next one, we could just flip through them. This is a smaller directional vehicular signage. This one would be at the second point of entry for cars, saying, yep, you're still on the right track. You could turn right into First Beach. You can also turn right to get to Second Beach, but straight ahead is the boat launch. And this is a secondary effort to make sure we're capturing cars who we don't want doing maybe a turnaround at the dead end, at the dead end at the end of the road, or turning into the boat launch and creating additional vehicular movement in that area that's unnecessary.
I think my feedback on that particular one would be to include the word parking for First Beach parking, Second Beach parking, and have those at the top of the sign, and then the boat launch being the sort of last listed item.
Yep, that's a great idea. I'll make a note of that.
I don't see any other hands at the moment. Oh, thank you, Sean.
Is that on? No. There we go. So the W, the welcome signage, it looks like people have to kind of walk through the parking lot to get to it. So is that primarily for vehicles as they're arriving on the site, so they would look at it through their car? Or so if I park and then I see that sign, then I have to kind of walk across the parking lot or whatever to get to it, which is potentially unsafe. So is the placement for that for pedestrians? And what is the access to that sign that ensures that pedestrians who may not have road or street safety or blind can access it without endangering themselves in traffic?
So that's a great question. Around Nanaimo, there are like kind of these flagpole signs saying, you know, Kin Park or Bevan Park, saying, and they're all in blue, and they're saying, you know, yes, you are here. Yes, you're headed in the right direction. And they're meant to be viewed as you kind of as a part of an entry sequence, just to kind of field confirm that you have arrived at the park. Because this is the main point of entry, we are looking to include it close to the sidewalk and at an angle towards the sidewalk and at an angle towards the parking lot. It's not the intent is not necessarily for once you're inside the parking lot to go back to that sign. There's really no information on it other than just saying and field confirming, yes, you are at Westwood Lake Park. And that's in keeping with a lot of the other park signage indicators that we have along the roadsides throughout Nanaimo that are, they have like a blue sort of L-shaped like flagpole, and then the sign is typically hanging from it. The other part about the sign is if we take into consideration the size of the sign, this is the largest sign and really accentuates the words Westwood Lake Park. And it's meant to be viewed as you kind of pass through the site. If you are not, if you're moving from the parking lot into Westwood Lake Park, that's where our key destination signage will start helping us inform a little bit more on where to go and where you are.
Okay, how are people feeling about the locations that are pitched for the directional pedestrian and vehicular signage? Everyone feeling good about those? I feel like it's interesting that there's not more signage around where the washroom cluster is, because I think that's going to be like a really key thoroughfare, but I guess you're trying to catch.
You're correct, Hillary. There's actually going to be quite a bit of information on the washrooms, but because we are managing right now, what we're looking at is the wayfinding, like outdoor strategy, but there will be accessible wayfinding information on the washroom itself, saying with graphics that are internationally recognized and Braille as well.
Okay, awesome. Jocelyn?
This might be a bit of a dumb question, but
No such
how
thing.
do you know if you take the driveway just before the sign, before the W sign, and you hook a left? When you come to that Y, the left-hand side goes past the accessible parking, the right-hand side goes off to more parking. How do you know which way to turn? Like what is down each of those roads?
That's a good question. Because it's a small space and because it's circular, you know, we haven't included anything else. It's got good sight lines. If you're a driver, there could be, if that's something that's considered, you know, important and helpful to help minimize kind of movement for cars going around, we could add another sign that indicates how to get to Second Beach.
I think because you have that big sign, and I think, does the welcome signage have the 3 arrows to the arrows to the other parking and
yes.
okay.
Yeah,
so
that's what we worked on this past week, and I had to
Right.
submit the presentation
Okay.
before. But yes, maybe the welcome sign, maybe it's not a good name for it. Really, what it is it's an indication that you've arrived at Westwood Lake and how you need to get somewhere to park.
Right.
The
That makes
real
sense to
welcome
me.
signage is going to be the kiosk, which will be at the trailhead, and that kiosk will be the largest pedestrian sign and show everything to do with maps, what's accessible slopes, even throughout the trail, just to give people indications on
Okay.
you know, what they can be expecting as they move and navigate throughout Westwood Lake.
So the reason I ask is that, I mean, I hope this will fix a lot of the delays and like snarls that happen up there in the middle of summer. But um, I think sometimes I don't really know. I have a terrible distance sort of sense, but um, I think sometimes you get a little bit confused when you're waiting for someone to go in a direction and you're in a bit of a backup. And the other thing is, even if it's close by, um, since the accessible parking has been in several different places, I would suggest maybe a small sign or use of it on a different sign that says where the accessible parking is specifically. Because I mean, once you've been once, you might know, but if it's your first time, you might not know where to go for the accessible spots.
It's a really great point. I think on that welcome signage, in keeping with, you know, we have boat launch go straight, we could also have accessible parking go straight so that you're not having to navigate throughout the whole parking lot to get there, that you're actually using the second entrance. And then on that smaller directional vehicular sign that is demarcated with the square and is pink, we could say turn right for accessible parking and turn right to go to First and Second Beach.
Perfect. That sounds
Yeah.
great.
Cool.
Okay, I'm going to go
That's
to
easy.
Councillor Armstrong and then Sean.
Yeah, my questions is on the DV sign. Why is it on the left hand instead of the right side? Because drivers usually always look to the right for directions, not to the left. And I'm concerned about the placement for coming out, blocking vision.
So what we've done to that road right of way is we've pinched it quite significantly to reduce the speed of traffic. The reason why it's not, you're talking about on the right side of the road, is that correct?
Well, you've got it on the left, and traditionally traffic control signs, everything are always on the left. And you're talking, or on the right, and you're talking to a person that doesn't believe in the pinching as well. So I don't see it.
Oh, okay.
I actually find it more dangerous, and there's actually studies that support that. But I'm just concerned that you've got it on the left side instead of the right side. And it's going to block also when people are coming out.
So we haven't, just to comment on the road right of way, it's still well within the City of Nanaimo standards, and it's not pinched to a point where you have just enough room to get by. It's just that there was such a swath of asphalt there that we've decided to allocate some of that space to sidewalk, which was a big ask that we heard from the ACAI review for Westwood, like for the Westwood Lake Phase 1 or Phase 2 portion. So the reason why it's not on the other side is it's residential. It's residential houses, and the concern is if we start focusing attention on the left side with no left turn available, or then you're actually distracting somebody's peripheral vision or vision as they move into the site, and because that is would be a crosswalk eventually, if the city is ever able to connect the north part of the site with a sidewalk that's even further north off-site. But the goal would be to have a sidewalk moving through that entire space.
And I'm assuming with the pinch that you've talked to the fire trucks, because I know they're struggling getting down some portions, just thinking, drowning. It's extremely important. And I mean, every emergency person you talk to does not agree with the pinch, right? Because it's so much more dangerous for them to drive and takes time away. So I just really hope the fire department and ambulance have been consulted. Thank you.
Yep, they've been consulted, and it's wider than the minimum.
Thank you.
That is a part of the CON standards for road widths. So
Thank
it's
you.
wider than that.
Sean?
Yes, why? I'm just curious about the directional pedestrian signs and why they seem clustered together in one space and not. So you have two directional vehicle signs depending on how people arrive and where they park. So that's pretty clear. And then you have the two directional pedestrian signs all on one side. So people, assuming it sort of presumes that people are going to access the beach going that way, and that's where they need direction. But then they would have to go all the way there. So depending on where they park or access the site, they have to walk all the way. If they decide to go the other way around, then they have to go there and go back. So why are they clustered there? Is that based on how people currently use this site or some other reason?
That's a great question. It's about site circulation, and I think we really only need one directional signage there. The sign that probably has the most comprehensive amount of information is the K2, the key destination, key pedestrian destination park, which does also have directional information on it. The signs demarcated as D1, so directional pedestrian signs, are more of a flagpole type of scenario where we have arrows saying, oh, you know what, you're 500 meters from, First Beach, or if you keep going right, you'll head to the washrooms. And they do have a small map on them too to locate yourself. But in this scenario, those are two decision points on where people, we expect people to navigate through. There's a sidewalk moving from north to south and meeting the scope of work at that first D1 sign. So we wanted to have that directional signage there as a landing zone for people entering the space from the parking lot and deciding on whether they need to go left or right to First Beach or to Second Beach or to the washrooms or to the trailhead kiosk. And then the second one was one that we added in after the fact, but this is a secondary pathway that that is used. Right now it's not very accessible in my opinion. The asphalt's all rooted up. There are plans to potentially really high level conceptual ideas on how we can refresh that, but we would like to make that more of a pedestrian circulation opportunity that is accessible and does not share movement corridors with vehicles. The movement corridor to the north, it does share, you end up on the road effectively, and we'd really like to prioritize, vehicular-free pedestrian circulation. And so that's why it's there as well, to let people know that they can still get to Second Beach from that location.
Thank you. Ms. Davis?
Thank you, Councillor Eastmere. Yes, I know there's a lot of good conversation being had at the moment, but I'm also cognizant of what is left in the presentation, and there is another decision point. So we may want to consider holding questions for now on this piece and allowing the presentation to move forward.
Yeah, thank you.
So we could move through these really quick. This is the K1 is the kiosk, the park kiosk, which will have kind of your wide range information on. The second one, K2, is almost a smaller version of the kiosk at each key destination. Next slide, please. And then the directional signage is similar to the key destination. It's just a little bit more pared down with a little bit more focused information on direction and where you are at the moment. The next signs show high level what the regulatory and interpretive signage might look like, and the directional trail markers, the regulatory trail markers, they can be used in isolation, or we could hybridize them, because sometimes we want to be able to put regulatory information on a trail marker as well, pending how that portion of the trail is used. So for that family of signs, one of the big questions that we have is what information would be most useful and most helpful in Braille, and what information should be tactile. There's a lot of information on what is, standard accessible requirements and uses for buildings and signs on building faces and for navigation around buildings, and less so for outdoor, trail navigation.
Richard?
So I'm happy to have more of a I forgot. Sorry.
You're good.
I actually received some correspondence just previous to this meeting from my CNIB contacts. They recommended that we reach out to the CNIB Access Lab, and they specifically specialize in this sort of endeavor because it is, like you kind of said, non-standardized. It might be just a matter of also experimentation a little bit too. For instance, the TAP trail that got installed up island a bit in Qualicum. Like that was only created after feedback and such, and lack of understanding that like blind people want to be able to explore the outdoors too. So it's kind of like a systemic issue, cultural issue, why there isn't that standardization.
Yeah, I would agree with you, and it became very apparent as I was just poring over documentation internationally, and there is not, sadly, there's not a lot of information that is standardized for outdoor wayfinding. There's
Yeah.
pieces that I can pull, and there's information that I can pull from, indicating, what heights should we be looking at, but there really isn't that set of standards to look to. So I think this piece is probably our most important piece to work through.
Yeah.
And with the way the project is going to run, it actually is going to be somewhat useful that we're going to be installing, I think, 5 out of the 7 signs that that we're developing for Westwood Lake Park at First Beach on its own. Because that'll sort of act as a preliminary, does this work? What doesn't work? What do we need to change for the rest of the signs? And Westwood Lake Park on its own will also be sort of a pilot project for the city of Nanaimo, because these standards will be eventually put into a playbook that we're going to create that will hopefully help inform how we manage wayfinding for all of city of Nanaimo's parks. So this,
Okay, so just in the interest of time, I'm gonna
Yeah.
let Sean jump in here.
Yeah, so just in terms of the question, what information would be most helpful in Braille and what information should be tactile? And my answer to that in terms of an accessibility answer would be that equitable access says all text should be also in Braille and all information that's not text should be tactile to ensure an equitable experience for everybody. And so if that's possible in collaboration with CNIB or other consultants, I think that's important to ensure equitable access to the space, right? So we're not picking and choosing what information is most important. It's all important, or if it's not important, then it's not important to anybody. Thanks.
there's also something that we're working on with like a QR code too. So there might be some information that we're able to kind of relay in different ways too. Is that something that would be considered?
Yeah, like a speech to text situation, or like a
Yeah.
audio version.
Sure. I think it's really that all information should be accessible to everyone who's accessing it. So whatever the means are to ensure that everyone has complete and equitable access, that it's across the board, and that we build in the systems to allow people to interact so that no one's missing information based on ability.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Next slide.
Yeah, we'll move on to the next slide.
All right, well, this one is starts to become a little fun. So David Martinello is designing Fluence, which is a bespoke piece of art for Westwood Lake Park, and we've left the kind of largest space of a building blank for him. His art piece is called Fluence, and it's meant to embody nature, and he has labored over his green color selections, trying to reflect the exact color of a leaf when light shines through it, and the color of moss and the color of lichen. And so we have two options right now to start considering a color palette, and one is this green option that would reflect David's installation, which is unique to Westwood Lake and also very representative of the, of the cedar and fir trees around and the Westwood Lake Trail, and the feeling you get when you move through that space. And then the second is a blue option that reflects blue tones of the building and also is a nod to the city of Nanaimo colors. So if you go to the next slide, one of the biggest things about our color selection is that one of the standards I did find that is basically universal and in most countries with with accessible standards on contrast is that you need a 70% light reflectance value contrast, and that's per the Canadian Accessible Standards. And that means that your writing and your background color need to contrast enough that it's legible. So what we've done is we've superimposed the white and the black text over the greens with David Martinello's art piece, as well as the blue, or like an average blue found within the building. And the combinations, what we found is the combinations that are highlighted in red meet or exceed that 70% contrast value for legibility. And the way we have found that is there's actually just calculators out there that allow me to input the R, G, and B values for each color. So today, what we're looking for is help in deciding which avenue we go down. Do we go down a green palette, or do we go down a blue palette? As we look at these colors, yeah. So this is an example of the contrast color. I've just used a typical green and a typical blue that we would find within the values that were presented above. So we're in good shape with a white text. We have a 91% contrast value with this average green, and the blue is looking like an 87. Now, these are just averages. We have space to refine these colors. If you go to the next slide, it shows an example of the green option, and the next one will be blue for the key destination and the directional signage. And I think a big thing to keep in mind is just that, once again, all this information on the boards are just acting as placeholders, so it's not as legible as it should be. And each word and all symbology shown, including the map, will be refined.
Okay, I'm going to go to Nicole.
Standards.
I did see her there. I think she just turned her camera off when she meant to unmute.
Am I there now? I'm having
we can
internet.
hear you. We can hear you, yeah.
Oh, I don't know where my camera's gone. Okay, so my first thought is that blue would be better than green because red, green, brown, for people who have color blindness differentiation, and you're going to have a lot of browns and greens behind these signs, right? So to be able to see the contrast, you can even, it looks like it's on a wood sign, right? Yes. Is that?
Yeah.
So if the contrast is similar, my input would be to go blue. But also to consider, I guess the finish, because we're talking about natural light and glare and things like that I don't think we could ever really look at in this context on a screen. But with all the natural greens and browns in the environment, blue is going to stand out better, in my opinion.
Thanks, Nicole. Richard?
I can very much concur. Speaking to my own personal experience, when I am seeing a space, everything is blurred. And so if what I'm looking for are the contrasts, the pops of color, when it has to do with wayfinding. So if it is starkly, very, very sharp difference from the rest of the background or the surrounding area, that's what allows me to be able to find the sign.
I appreciate that feedback. Are we wanting to take a vote on whether everyone's on board with blue? Would that make people feel comfortable? Okay, so maybe Richard, do you want to move that, or?
Well, the thing is, even having even more sharp differences in the color would just bring up that visual perception of the signage. So if you were to increase saturation or the contrast between the text and that even more drastically than the 70%. That would also allow like phones that are trying to get the text on the image a little bit easier when there is like a really harsh difference in the text in the background. So sorry to then throw a curveball there, but
I think
that's a good
from the
point.
basic standpoint of blue versus green.
yeah, the blue obviously.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah.
Yeah.
So Richard's going to move it. Councillor Armstrong seconding it, and I'll just take a vote. If all in favor of blue. Okay, it's a unanimous vote for blue. But really appreciate the options because yes, there's certainly like aspects to the green that look really appealing, but this is why people with lived experience, like giving that input is so important. So thank you so much for that.
You bet. That kind of concludes our presentation. I really appreciate the feedback. The more I think about the blue, the more applicable it is, and we can actually not then change the color for each park. We would just keep the color the same. And that's something that really stands out to me when I'm going around Nanaimo, is just that when you see a blue sign that has a park name on it, you know that you're close to that park. And so I think that is also another just accessibility consideration, that your mind is already thinking, oh, okay, that's a park sign. So yeah, I think that to your point, Richard, that's why we need to refine the colors and just try and get the biggest increases for those contrast values. I have included a couple of tones of blue so that the side stripe for the blue might be a little bit brighter so that it stands out.
Thank you. Sorry, I just see Jocelyn, your hand is up right now. Jocelyn, did you have a comment you wanted to jump in here before we move on?
I do, yeah. I just wanted to know whether the map is something that you've already got set out, what it looks like, what version. Okay. It sounds like we have other things we have to talk about today, but I'm just curious, just as a general thing, I would love to see that map include points of importance in terms of accessibility. Like, I don't know even if it's still there because I won't even chance it now, but there used to be that tree across the path to the south, I think. I don't know. And a wheelchair user could still go along a big chunk of that trail if they knew that was there and that they should come back. So those types of things. I'd be happy to look at it if that's helpful. Or I think maybe we as a group should.
Yeah,
I think that's a great idea.
It sounded like some of these pieces might be finalized before our next meeting, so that's why we wanted to get this feedback in today. But Ms. Davis?
I just want to thank the committee for their investment of time on this item today. And yes, we won't have the opportunity to come to another meeting. However, if the committee were comfortable, we could send out, electronically and have some feedback discussions on as a side to this to allow us to be able to meet, detailed design.
I love that idea. Technically, Ms. Ricard.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Quorum of members discussing things in an email or in a coffee shop would constitute a formal meeting, and such would not be possible. It's not advisable procedurally.
But perhaps if you were reaching out to individual committee members in the context of like their professional role, then that may be appropriate. Just if it just can't be like copied to all committee members.
Understood, and perhaps in this case, then I could speak with Ms. Maffin on the map issue.
Okay, thank you so much. I really appreciate the presentation, and in the interest of time, we are going to move on now, but thank you for the presentation, for your work on this, and to the committee members.
Great, thanks everybody.
Thank
we
you.
really appreciate the input.
All right, next up, we have under reports, parking and curbside management, accessibility challenges and opportunities in Nanaimo, and this is going to be introduced by Jamie Rose, our manager of transportation.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for having us. We're talking about parking, and I think one of the things that I want to start with is reminding everybody that while the last presentation was very detailed and very granular, we're going to stay up at a nice high level and just get some real key themes from this group. The City of Nanaimo So the City of Nanaimo is reviewing its parking strategies basically from top to bottom. Parking in Nanaimo has been a requirement of developments for ages. It's been very formulaic and been drafted based on sort of typical industry standards, but as I'm sure you're all aware, the industry is changing very rapidly. The expectations are kind of pivoting quickly to meet the needs of everybody. And so we're also drilling down to how we manage our curb space. And so this is one aspect of transportation and land use planning, but really it all kind of encompasses and is a reflection of the goals and expectations that were established through city plan to really make our city more vibrant, livable, affordable, safer, and more sustainable. And so I'm going to go fairly quickly through my presentation slides here, because really what I want to focus on is the conversation. And so in the fall of 2025, or 2024, sorry, we engaged a consultant, and I believe Mr. Casey is online here to help support any questions that come up. And so there was a background report or a baseline report that was presented to council in December. And so that was a lot of the preliminary findings of how parking is operated and managed through the city. And that was part of the information package that was circulated through the agenda. And so with this, you can see we've done our baseline. We're now at the engagement phase. We've had a project website on the Get Involved platform for a little over 2 weeks now. We've had a survey open for approximately a week as well. And we really encourage people to focus comments there, because that gives us a little bit of an easier point of ingestion and ability to reconcile those. Just a footnote to that, we have opted to extend the survey for another 2 weeks, just to make sure that anybody who wants to share their thoughts with us has that chance. And so getting down to the brass tacks of it, these are some key questions that we have for the committee. Even as recently as about half an hour ago, parking was brought up. And so at different times I've been here and heard different comments and questions about how parking is dealt with across the city. And so this is really kind of that opportunity to bring some of those thoughts forward, to reflect on the questions that we've got presented here, and give both myself and the committee and our consultant the option to hear what the committee has to think about them, and potentially take some of those thoughts and questions back to anybody that you engage with, and share sort of those conversations, and potentially encourage them to feedback into our survey that's online. And so, as I say, I really want to kind of make this a conversational type session. And so there are 4 questions up here, and I guess what, if possible, what I'd like to do is just sort of encourage members to raise their hands and weigh in on any of these elements that speak to them.
Great, yeah, I'll take a speakers list and start with Sarah.
Hi there. I'm mobility challenged. I use a walker, and due to my work, I do go downtown quite a bit. My go-to for parking is the parkade beside the Port Theatre, and I have a spot that I like to use that's handicapped. It's between the 2 elevators. I need to use an elevator. I can't use stairs. So I'm usually down there during the week, and that's fine. I was there on the weekend, Saturday, February 22nd, and discovered that access to both elevators was blocked because it was the weekend. And that I had to get to the library, I ended up having to walk out of the parkade with my walker all the way out to the street. And then, anyway, if I hadn't had an appointment, I would have gotten back in my car and gone home, because I was almost in tears, because it's very frustrating to be someone who can't walk properly without an aid, who is stranded somewhere because both elevators are closed because it's the weekend. So I guess my question is that a common practice? And if so, why is it? And what can we do to stop that? Because it made me feel very unwelcome downtown. But it also just really concerned me.
Yeah, thank you. And this is an ongoing challenge that we've had because of the conference center, being open to events, but then on weekends they don't have people in the building. So it's a challenge that's due to the security and the location of the elevators. But absolutely hear you on that. I think we might need to address that separately, just because it really has more to do with the conference center itself than that parking space. But Mr. Rose?
Sorry, I completely agree. I think that is a very operational centric problem we have, but it does sort of delve into that question of the accessibility to and from spots, on a 24/7, 365 basis. And so we sort of touch on like the quality and the quantity of spots, but also how to get to them or from them. And so, and I do want to preface that I think we've noted downtown on the slides, but really this is a citywide study, so that, if you've got an example from Country Club or Woodgrove or the university or the NIC or NAC, those are all absolutely valid points of question, or on street as well, because we are capturing all of this. And so, so I think that A, that is an operational question, but B, that is something that we need to kind of consider as we discuss this sort of siting and placement of stalls.
I do want to point out too, though, that my options for parking downtown were extremely limited because Commercial Street was all blocked off.
Is a construction zone right now. Yeah.
So even if I had made another choice, my options were limited. So just putting that out there, I understand that obviously this is a more complex issue, but as just a simple city user, it wouldn't have occurred to me that this would have been a challenge.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. I'm going to go to Tammy, then Jocelyn, then Sean.
Oh, you can pass.
Okay, so Jocelyn?
I would kind of second Sarah's comment. I rely a lot on the parking lot by Port Place. Am I right in assuming that is like the convention center parking lot that serves like the Port Theater and a bunch of different? Okay. And I go to the library on the weekends all the time and rely on that elevator. I have never found it not functioning, but obviously because it's such a public elevator, it often is in bad shape. And but I've never had trouble, like I've never not been able to use it. But if it wasn't functioning, it would be a bit of a struggle to kind of wheel out to the street and around and up. And I think as an operational point, you realize that for accessible parking, I think people really rely on that lot. Whereas non-accessible parking, street side parking and stuff, there's a lot more available, like right beside the shops. And I also use the parkade by the overpass. And like by the Work BC building and stuff. And I do find it quite helpful, although I've heard that there's confusion about whether users of the accessible space that's on the street level have to go down and buy a ticket or not. I personally never buy a ticket, but maybe you guys are going to come after me for fines. But it involves like going down a whole level to do that, and I'd like to save my shoulders for other activities.
Mr. Rose can answer that question specifically.
I can relieve your conscience and let you know that you did not have to buy a ticket for it. So the on-street is sort of a separate management than the off-street. So the parkades, they're kiosk and ticketed. I'll actually touch on that a little bit later in the meeting, but they are two separate kind of functions of parking. Really, typically we see street parking as more short-term pick up, drop off, or 1 or 2 hour appointments or stops, whereas parkades are more typically longer duration, work or event or type, something like that. So, so I think what I'm hearing is some clarification as to what applies on street versus off street, and so yeah, that's hopefully clarified that.
And my only, well, I have a lot of frustration with parking lots, but I know a lot of them are private and they're not owned by the city. But I'm really, I get quite frustrated at the fact that developers are still developing to a certain standard of accessible spaces, even though our average age is older, and even in buildings that are like all medical practices, where you would think that there would be more people needing those accessible spaces. Like I have Millstone Medical, the new one further down the street. I can never find an accessible space. And if I can't park at my doctor's office, where am I going to go? So I just considering how to work with developers on like matching the use type with an adequate accessible parking, and they don't tend to use access aisles very much, which I can't get out of my van without an access aisle. So and on street, the angle parking by the Old City Quarter is an absolute pain in the patootie for me. There's just not enough there. So, and those are like all those businesses. They have one
That's on
accessible
Wesley
parking.
Street? Yeah, okay,
Right, in front of the bookstore.
right.
So I'll stop talking now.
No, this is really kind of why we're here, to kind of pull this information out, and so we've had a lot of conversations in the past about other things, and it's really helped us guide some decisions. And so I'm curious about two things, and I'm kind of scrambling my order here, but the angle parking in the Old City Quarter, I guess I'm a little bit curious. Which is sort of more challenging? Is it the orientation being angle, or is it the number of spaces?
Both are a problem. And one thing is that the one space the ramp is right behind where the rear wheel would be. And so depending on the length of your vehicle, you might not actually be able to use the curb cut. And I have a van with a sort of like lift sort of thing in it. Angle parking generally is a little easier for some reason, because sometimes the passenger door is a little, like the behind the driver is a little bit behind the edge of the car next to you. So sometimes I can make that work in a pinch. In that space, I don't know why, I have a lot of trouble with it. And there's not enough room normally for me to get my chair out in that space, even though it's an accessible one. But they're also just, there's nowhere else to go, so I tend to park in the church lot. And a handicap spot or like an accessible parking placard can get you away with a lot of things. But if someone's using theirs, I can't. It's a little harder. And there, at least I haven't seen any other accessible spaces on that whole street. So.
Okay. And so the follow up to something you mentioned earlier was the number of spaces sort of related to a specific business, the example being like a healthcare provider. And so I think this is something that, again, is definitely something we're gonna pull apart. And so I think that sort of is the question of figuring out a mechanism to determine how many should be suitable there. And so I think that's something that we'll need to kind of explore a little more deeply to try and figure out what that answer is. The last piece is, and I'm going to very sort of delicately touch this because I don't want to get too far into the details here, because I feel we could get lost there. But when you talk about aisle sizing and space and stall sizing, are you aware of either any examples that you would say are good, or are you aware of any areas that do a better job of it that we should potentially look at?
If you're asking me, I was part of a Spark design charrette that it compares a lot of lots and sizes and access aisles. My preference is to have a standard or accessible space with an access aisle, because the tendency is that people will park in odd arrangements, and then you won't have room even though it's an accessible space. And many of the older accessible spaces are not big enough for standard vans anymore. And so that's one struggle. But to give you an example of something that works, I'm trying to so the Equality Foods in Harewood, the access aisles are honestly narrower than I would have expected, but there's one between each space pretty much. And that helps because often you don't need both access aisles. And I think the Hello Ferries parking lot has a good one as well. But I haven't seen a lot of examples of the kind of access aisle spaces that I would love to see, which is a bit more like the ADA model. But I think Linda could probably tell you more examples than I could. But and I saw on your diagram for the Westwood Lake map that I didn't realize they were moving into that curved area, which is fantastic because I parked there the other day and I was like, these are not accessible spaces. Now I understand.
Okay, I do have a big speakers list. I've got Sean, Richard, Cheryl, Tammy, and Linda. So just sort of will be mindful of wanting to get everyone's comments in. So Sean?
Thank you. So I'll start out with an unreasonable point, which is that if 27% of people in Canada experience disability, then 27% of our parking should be accessible. Obviously, it's not, and probably not reasonable to say that we should hold back a quarter of all parking for accessibility, as much as I would love to set that standard and show other cities what we can do. But I do think that most accessible parking tends to be off-street. If by off-street, that means like in a parkade or in a specified parking zone versus on-street parking. And so that limits some accessibility. So the first question, is there enough spaces downtown? Possibly, but most of it's off-street, so it doesn't provide equitable access. So more on-street accessible parking would be that. Two, the quality of accessible parking around the city is kind of the same answer as it is to one, which is that, and the old city quarter is an interesting example because the only accessible parking in the quarter is on Wesley Street, which means you have to get onto that one-way street, park, and then to get off it, you have to go down, loop around, come back on, and turn back onto Fitzwilliam Street. Sorry, I'm getting excited. I love talking about parking. So, you know, if you just want to jump into a store there, it is a whole thing to get in and get in and get out. That's not the same level of access. So I wonder if there is a model somewhere in the world for accessible parking that is also short-term parking for non-accessible users. So parkers that don't require accessibility, maybe 15 or 20-minute limits on that. If you require accessible parking, then those parking spaces are available to you. But other than that, it's short term. Again, I've done no research in this and don't know if it's possible, but that's one idea. The challenges we face is, just that there's generally not the same levels of access. So you have to walk further to get to the thing because the parking in front of the thing isn't as available. And often that's more difficult for people with mobility challenges. When there's a lot of on-street parking, things are just more narrow and harder for people to get through. Sidewalks have limited access. So generally all of that stuff, because we're building parking for people mostly that don't require accessibility and then adapting the world to create accessible parking instead of designing systems that are all accessible that support parking for everybody. So I know that's a huge challenge in, 150-year-old cities, but that's something to think about is if you design all parking to be somewhat accessible, then you don't have to worry about these things as much. And unrelated to parking, what changes would enhance access to daily needs? I think there's interesting stuff to be said about making sure corridors in general are accessible, because when you have a lot of on-street parking, those corridors become narrow and they become more difficult for alternative transportation methods to access those spaces, buses, handy dart, other things like that. So in lieu of accessible parking, making sure that those corridors are suitable, that alternate transportation methods can move people equitably to those spaces. I know that's out of the purview of our transportation plan in the city because you don't control transit, but you can control the sort of width of the corridor to make sure that when people need to access those spaces, they can do so in ways that are safe and allow them to get off and get to the place they need to go quickly. Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Armstrong?
Thank you. This is coming from a group of seniors that met with me, and they talk about it's great if you have the handicap sign, you can do that, but a lot of them rely on walkers and don't quite qualify to get the placards. So when they talk about parking lots that they like, they all love Costco because they're all wide spots, and I think Jocelyn hit the nail on the head. Most vehicles, I think they're between 2 and 3 inches bigger than they used to be 5 years ago. We haven't accommodated that for that in our parking regulations. We're still the small spots. When you go to some of the malls and you see the small spots, there's a car taking up a spot and a half because they're too small. So I heard that from a lot of them, that they need to get their walkers out. Where their walkers are? They're in the back because a lot of them have the SUVs, and there's not enough room for them to open up and bring out their walkers. So they struggle with that, and that's why they don't come downtown, a lot of them. I also heard, again, and I think Jocelyn touched on it, is if you have the sidewinder vans, like you have to get out from the side, and we don't accommodate that. Prime example was up at Collery Dam where they couldn't get out, their wheelchairs couldn't get out because the spot was too narrow and no place for them to move out. So those were the things hit by the seniors that I spoke with. Thank you.
Tammy?
I have a question about the Special Olympics. Does at the track has an event at the track, and there is not enough accessible parking right around the track where it's needed really for that purpose. I've heard that a lot.
Yeah, so your question is like, if we have a special event where it is bringing a large number of people who have accessibility needs as far as parking, do we have the ability to pivot on that or to address that on a case-by-case basis?
I think that there's sort of two elements to that. I think that we need to design facilities to operate on a day in, day out basis, but we do also have to have that plasticity to shift and say, okay, we're going to have 5,000 extra people or 10,000 extra people here. How do we do that? And I think that sort of to Sean's perspective, some of the things we're trying to do is trying to migrate people to alternative modes if possible. However, if not possible, then we would need to establish sort of a specific area that can accommodate that.
So the school district has a special field day at the track, and it's, they don't always they only have so many wheelchair buses. So they're relying on the parents to bring all their children, but they don't have the accessible parking. Yeah, which is very frustrating.
Jocelyn? Oh, you're muted at the moment.
Sorry, I just wanted to say I remembered a really great example of accessible spaces, and that's at Maffeo Sutton Park. And if there could be like 10 more, that would be amazing. But for like big events and parades and stuff. But that is a really helpful format. And, it might not fit every car. I think it's still not the wide aisle, but it's so much better than almost every other park has. So
nice.
Way to go.
Do we have like tiered, or does it exist like different types of accessible parking, like making sure that you have spots reserved for people with like vans that have the larger accessibility needs? So that I see Jocelyn shaking her head.
Yeah.
Like
there's a movement to do that, but I think the struggle is it would not then expand the number of spaces. It would cut the number of spaces because then some would be van accessible, and the van advocates are like, well, then it's just for us because we can't park in the other ones. So I think that is a hot button issue in my world at the moment.
Okay. Well, yeah, I'd be interested to hear if there was anything you think we could pilot in Nanaimo or try. We could be on the cutting edge of that.
One thing
great ideas right here.
One thing I was just going to highlight, like, we don't need examples from Nanaimo per se. Like, if you've seen something in Vancouver, or Seattle, or Calgary, or wherever, like, we're sure.
Okay,
They drive
I do
golf
see
carts.
Linda has her hand up. Linda, you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, Accessibility Standards Canada and the CSA group have partnered and put out a set of accessibility standards, which I've mentioned a lot at these meetings. So it's CSA B651-23, Accessible Design for the Built Environment. And they divide parking spots, as Jocelyn was just saying, into two types. So accessible parking stalls are wide with an aisle between them so that people can choose which side, whether they get out on the driver's side or the passenger side. And then that accessible aisle leads to a curb cut. So they come two at a time. They come two at a time with an aisle, so they probably take 4 spots. And then what they call limited mobility stalls are what we have the most of, which is just a wide parking spot with a wheelchair painted on the ground. And those are for people with walkers or canes or but aren't loading a van. But they have very, very clear indications of how wide does the aisle need to be, how wide does the parking spot need to be. If you're doing parallel parking, you need to have a clear space behind that parking spot so a van can get out the back of a wheelchair can get out the back of a van.
Okay.
But yeah, the federal government and Canadian Standards Association have put a lot of thought into all of this stuff. So, and it's free, Jamie. Just Google it. I've sent it to Sharon and Hillary before, so maybe they still have it.
Okay, we will check those out. I'm going to go to Bay. See your hand up there. You're muted at the moment.
Sorry about that. Took a moment to figure out the mute button. I just wanted to say, with regards to large events and special events, perhaps you would be able to set up temporary accessible parking where you can extend it into what is usually considered regular spots, using some sort of markers and signs temporarily, to just sort of alleviate some of that overflow and high demand.
Absolutely. Thanks. Thank you for that. Can we just pull that slide up that has your list of questions again? Okay. And I think one thing I did hear during the snow event that we had was the importance of clearing snow around accessible parking spaces as a priority, recognizing that those folks are, it's especially difficult in the snow. And so any, city spots that are accessible spots, I think, need to be prioritized for snow clearing.
So I just want to sort of make sure we flesh out the whole conversation. It sounds like a lot of this dialogue's going on around the off-street stuff, and I maybe want to kind of poke and prod at the on-street and sort of get some. I've heard that there's not enough, and I've heard that the angle can be good and it can be bad, but I'm wondering if there's any other kind of thoughts or experiences that might help understand a little bit more around how that functions. Proximity of curb cuts, surface treatments between parking and sidewalk, placement of any other street furniture, et cetera, between sidewalk and stalls. Is there anything along those lines?
I think we're so hungry for all of us. We're like, yes, all of that sounds good. But I'm going to go to Jocelyn and then Richard.
So just to give you an idea of, like, I'm a small portion, I think, of accessible parking users. I have a van with a side lift that comes out right behind the driver's seat. And so for me, I don't mind using curb parking on a road that's not too busy, because I have to put my lift out with my chair into traffic. So for example, like I wouldn't do it on the Island Highway, but I would do it on Commercial Street. Because I can see traffic easily both ways, and they're not going so fast that I feel like I am in danger. Um, and I especially like I enjoy having as long as it's not a steep hill, having curb parking near the shop I want to go to, because that's the limitation of the parking lot of the convention center, is that it's not close to everything. And if it's raining and that kind of thing, I would love the option to be near the place I need to go. And the things that make that harder, that I wouldn't use curb parking, is if the curb cut is pretty far away and the sidewalk's pretty, high. And if I can't reach if there's a parking meter on the street or on the curb, if a lot of them are mounted high enough that I can't read them. So I wouldn't be able to if I had to pay for it. So I think a lot of folks who have disabilities that affect their energy level and their number of steps they can take, but they don't use a wheelchair, might prefer that kind of parking. But I think we don't use as much of it in the high pedestrian areas, and I would love to see a little bit more curb parking with space. At the very least, so folks who do walk but need a close parking space have that proximity to where they want to go in our like pedestrian market sort of situations. But also for a lot of us, it's, any additional accessible parking is better than the situation we're currently in. So to me, I'm like, oh, that's great. Then they won't need the big ones in the parkade so that they'll be available for me.
Okay, Richard.
I feel very strongly that a lot of the reasoning why a lot of the side street parking is at such a minimum in some areas of town is because of the developments that have been going in place. So for instance, in the North End, there's been a whole bunch of new apartment buildings that are being built. At these complexes, they make room for just maybe 4 to 6 visitors parking stalls. Which then for like a space of 400 apartments, that's not very much. And so then most people have to like park 2 blocks away or in like a shopping area and using up the space of the shopping area to be able to get to the apartments. So having more actual parking spaces being mandated for apartment complexes would reduce the amount of stress that are on the actual streets. For my father, who is becoming more mobility impaired in his age, it's getting a lot harder for him to walk those further distances just to be able to visit someone in an apartment, right? Yeah.
So I'm not sure exactly which locations you're referring to, but I do kind of need to add the footnote that
Sure.
The province has introduced some new legislation that creates some restrictions on how much parking can can be expected.
I don't want to say my current address, but
No, I'm not asking for it. I guess I'm just making sure that there's some clarity as to there are things that are beyond our control, and I think that. So legislation relates to proximity to transit exchange, and for residential, there's limitations, almost outright, or like barriers to requiring any parking for residential developments. Yeah. But there's I think there's some options to discuss visitor parking and accessible parking, because those are not part of that legislation discussion. And so,
and I think this is why this is highlighting like that we need more on-street accessible parking spots, and we're going to require more if we don't have a crisis now, we are going to soon And as we try to support the shift for some folks to move away from single vehicle ownership and who may be able to take transit or ride a bike or car share, the community that relies on their vehicle for accessibility and mobility absolutely needs a parking space. And so those are the folks we need to make sure have somewhere to park, because they're not going to be easily able to make that transition away from a vehicle.
Yeah, I might even go one step further and highlight the cost of even additional curb space, in that there's just not so much. Like, we can't build more of it, or we can, but it is wildly expensive. And so this really comes back to this question of, how essential is car ownership? And, how do we navigate the costs that are going to be borne by everybody to maintain sort of the basically fairly easy access to parking on street or off that we have right now. And obviously that's caveated by some areas have more and less demand. But it gets down to that further question of, how do we manage our curb space and what are our priorities? And I'm hearing loud and clear, like, accessible spots closer to the destinations are high priority for this group. And so this also then is balanced off by, how do we provide loading for businesses, because they need the materials to sell to customers or to produce food at a restaurant. So this is this give and take that we're trying to navigate right now. And so, as I say, we go through this engagement process and hear from different groups from the community. And
so we have, I'd say, maybe 10 more minutes for this presentation, because then we have a few verbal reports. So I do see Sean and Nicole.
I don't actually know the answer to this question, but given where we are, so how many of the spaces, like if I walked out onto Dunsmuir Street, how many of the space, because there is some limited on-street parking in front of the SARC building. I don't think any of those are accessible parking or reserved parking. I think they're just general, like 2-hour parking. I think one of the spaces in the lot across the street is accessible. I don't think there's any accessible parking on Franklin Street. I think there's a gravel parking lot. I don't think there's any accessible parking on, is it Roberts or whatever? Yeah, so as an indication of like where there needs to be more accessibility, one change could be, why are the spaces, the on-street parking in front of the city building, in front of the SARC building, not accessible, not reserved for accessibility? I mean, certainly people can park on Franklin Street, or they can park on the hill, or they can park any number of places, and if they have the mobility, they can walk. If you don't, there's literally one space you can park, so you actually can't really come here. So that would be an example, and it would be an interesting thing to do a field trip and be like, okay, like how would you access this building? And so I think those can be some simple changes, is just look and say, if the people that need the least amount of distance between where they arrive and where they have to go is reserved for accessibility, that's always a good place to start. If that's one accessible space every reasonable block, some of our blocks are very small, so it doesn't need to be like that. But it's a good rule of thumb to say, if it's the hardest for you to travel as far as everyone else, then you need that sort of shortest distance between 2 points. And so let's make sure that we create that at every point that someone might want to go, whether it's the art gallery, the SARC building, the old city quarter. So that's just a thought that you can do some visual inspecting and say, if I had a mobility challenge, how far would I have to go to get to the place I need to be? Thanks.
Nicole?
Just to echo something about the accessible parking around like medical facilities, this hospital area is really underserviced as far as parking in general, but more specifically in the case of accessible parking. And I think that on-street parking is city controlled. So I'd like to see that improved in that hospital district. And then I think another piece that needs to be remembered is the enforcement. Too often I see spaces being used as pick up, drop off. Oh, you know, nobody's needs it right now, so people have just they're maybe even still in their vehicle, but it doesn't make it okay, and it's very frustrating. I see this a lot at the arenas and the pool. People without placards, sitting waiting to pick up their children, and I realize it's not a planner's problem, it's a bylaw problem, but I think that is part of the answer to making sure that things are available where they should be and when they should be.
Thank you. Okay, well, I'll give a last chance for final comments. I'm not seeing any hands, so I really appreciate this presentation today, Mr. Rose. Thank you so much. And the online survey still exists, and there's still time, and we'll make sure that that's shared.
Yep, I think the last slide in the presentation had the QR code for it, if I'm not mistaken. And as I said earlier, the survey has been extended for another 2 weeks. I think it goes till the 28th. So tell your friends, I don't want to hear about parking.
Thank you for your efforts on this. Okay, and then under other business, we have a verbal update. Get back up there. A verbal update on a bylaw update for accessible parking in parkades.
Yeah, so I think I kind of touched on this earlier. The way parking is managed in our downtown right now is that anybody displaying an accessible placard can park for free. There's actually a line in bylaw 5000, which is our street and traffic and highway bylaw, that outlines that operational capacity. It's unclear in the bylaw as to how that applies in parkades. And so over the last half dozen years or so, we've been experiencing some significant operational challenges effectively with people abusing that option. And so just as a housekeeping exercise, we're going to be rewording that and removing that article from the bylaw, and instead replacing the same basic intent to not require payment for the first period of time in the parkades purely through signage. And so it'll just, it's a bit of an exchange, but it's just a cleanup to manage this challenge we're facing. So if you hear anything, that's what the reality of it is, in case anybody has any questions or concerns about how something's being revoked or removed. So yeah, that's it.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. Really appreciate it. Next up, we have an update on the Neck Point parking lot from Charlotte Davis, our Deputy Director of Parks and Natural Areas.
Thank you. Yes, I have a list of comments that have been included in the latest design that were received at the previous meeting from the Accessibility Committee. So the things that are now included in the design are curb cuts for accessible stalls, multiple locations for accessible parking stalls throughout the parking lot, a trailway for parking stalls, so that is to be paved and so you can get out this space behind the vehicles. More accessible stalls and less small stalls. So we removed 2 small stalls and added 1 accessible stall and a second raised crosswalk. There will be 3 crosswalks in total in the parking lot. So those were the comments that we received and the changes that we made to the design based on the last meeting. So we don't yet have a completed design, but we do hope to complete this project later this year. So thanks very much.
Amazing. Did anyone have any questions about that? Or it's really amazing to hear the list of comments that have been incorporated, and really appreciate that. And I know we won't have a chance to review it again before it gets done, but that means that things are happening and it's going to be paved sooner rather than later.
That's right. Big thanks to the committee for all the comments.
Thank you. Next up, we have a verbal update on the LEAP passes. That's our Leisure Economic Access Pass from Darcy Osborne, our Director of Parks, Recreation and Culture.
Good evening. As you know, we have undergone a LEAP review, and I've presented those revisions and what we had been looking at recently. But as reported at the last meeting, we currently have free admission in some of our cultural partners, which would be the Nanaimo Art Gallery and the Nanaimo Museum. And at that point, there was question around whether or not we might be able to proceed with having a partnership with our LEAP program with the Port Theatre. I wasn't able to speak to it at that moment because because we were in the process of negotiating, but we have been able to move forward, and we do have the Port Theatre now online and supporting our LEAP program, and just recently launched a partnership this past week. We piloted an offering of 30 free tickets through the Theatre Angels program to all LEAP clients for a performance coming up in May called A Simple Space. This is a family-friendly acrobatic show for all ages and is part of the Port Theatre Spotlight series presentation. It was a huge success and sold out in less than an hour, or the tickets were distributed in less than an hour. Some people were quite concerned about how we ran out of tickets so fast, but we were actually very excited because it meant that we had a really good response and that this can sort of set the bar for how we would move forward. We are now going to try to look towards other organizations within the community that might be able to work with us on our LEAP program in offering tickets for different types of performances. So now we have a little bit more work to do, but we're excited to work with the Port Theatre, and it has been a really wonderful sort of move forward and pilot project. And staff member Laura Clarkson has been working with David Warburton, the general manager of the Port Theatre, and says it's been a very positive experience. So.
That is so great to hear. The Port Theatre is an amazing venue, and yeah, this is a really good first step. One show, but we'll grow from here.
That's right, one at a time.
Yeah, amazing. If there's any questions about that piece, I don't see any. And so next up, we have an update on local community accessibility grants.
That's correct. Thanks to the support of this committee and, of course, our mayor and council, the city of Nanaimo applied for, and it was approved for, $25,000 from the Spark BC for a local community accessibility grant. These funds were used to purchase and for the installation of 7 hearing devices for the front counters at all 5 of our recreation centers. The devices auto-connect to a customer's hearing aid to allow them to hear more clearly what the clerk or cashier is saying on the other side of the glass, which is a huge barrier for many of our patrons. This project is now complete, with the exception of one of our wickets at the Bevan Park pool, as we had some issues with connecting. However, 2 of the wickets are now connected. This is the office where our switchboard is located. In addition, we also secured city funds from our operational budget to purchase 1 more for the Bevan Park Social Center front counter, which is a recently opened new registrations counter that we're operating. So this has been very successful, and we're really pleased to be able to say that we now have these devices in all 5 of our recreation centers.
That is awesome, and that was endorsed by the committee, so
absolutely,
it's great to see that come to fruition and for the grant to come through.
Yep. Wonderful addition to our facility services.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that update. Tammy?
Is that a yearly grant?
I don't think so. I know that we were advised that the grant was coming out, but I don't believe that there was an end date on it. We could just apply and up to a certain amount of funding, up to $25,000, which we did fully. But I believe there was no sort of timeline on it, so I don't think it would be annual.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So then we have question period.
Yes, Madam Chair, the questions can be taken either on the report or other business items from the members of the public, if there are any.
Okay, I'm not seeing any questions. So anything urgent anyone needs to add before we move adjournment? I know it's a big question. I would just like to say, yes, we have our work plan, but if there are important issues you would like to see the Accessibility Committee address at an upcoming meeting, please feel free to reach out to myself or Councillor Armstrong.
At one point, Hillary, you were talking about a list of things that the city was doing, or that they problems that they see. Do we have that?
When was I saying this? Because we got lists on lists, baby. We got lists in my head. We've got the our integrated action plan.
Like what, the things that are
The integrated
on-
action plan?
things that are on the city's radar that need addressing, basically, and things that we should be,
We do-
as a committee, should be aware of?
Well, we've got the work plan for the committee, but then we also have the integrated action plan of priority items that came directly from city plan. And then a number of those have been prioritized by council, and then others sort of just exist on this rolling list that we come back to. So I can definitely show you where that lives. And I think we sort of do a yearly check-in on those. Ms. Osborne?
Through the chair to Tammy, I think it might also be the Rick Hansen Foundation listing of different facilities and/or parks that have been revised or reviewed that you might be thinking about. No?
Mr. Rose? Your mic?
Sorry, through the chair. Engineering did present earlier in the year with kind of a list of things that we were working on throughout the year. Is that possibly? Okay. So I think one of the ones that we were talking about at that time was the parking. I don't recall off the top of my head what the rest of them were, but.
So maybe we could bring a verbal update to the next meeting to just remind us of that list and see where we're at on it, because time moves quickly. Okay, thank you. Wonderful, everyone. Well, thank you so much for your time and attention today. Thank you to staff for being here and to the presenters. And if I could have a motion to adjourn, moved by Councillor Armstrong, seconded by Tammy. All in favor? Okay, and thank you to everyone who joined us online as well today. Nice to see your lovely